Welcome again, everyone, to this REopt training for resilience for the State Energy Program Technology Action Group. Welcome to our first tutorial. We're doing the working with load data today. So the agenda for today is that we will be covering kind of just an overview of what load data is needed, the importance of having accurate load data, where we could source that load data for the modeling done in REopt. The next section kind of goes through how REopt models load data when a site is not able to kind of access direct measurements. And then we will kind of dive deeper into the considerations that we typically have for cleaning and just processing actual raw data that a site is able to access through the utility, and then kind of speak a little bit about defining critical loads for outages and resilience considerations, and finish off with next steps and Q&A. So given that this is our first session, so any feedback would be really appreciated. And if you guys just kind of have questions at any time, feel free to drop them in the chat. Or just unmute yourselves and ask, whatever could be most helpful. The first topic we're covering, just general load data overview. So the importance of load data for the REopt modeling can't be emphasized enough. So a REopt is a time series model that kind of considers all time steps throughout the year, differing from models that kind of look at more aggregated energy consumption or production values. So kind of instead of looking just at how much energy is produced by a PV system over a year compared to how much the site consumes over the same period, we really kind of want to dig into the specific timing of loads and resources, and kind of the importance of having these hourly and sub-hourly variations considered, as they can really kind of impact the economic resilience case for renewable energy technologies at a site. So for example, here on this plot, it kind of shows what a typical REopt dispatch looks like, what the different sources of energy are going to meet this load in black. The PV is providing some peak shaving. The battery is kind of supplementing that and kind of doing energy arbitrage. And all of these kind of potential value streams that really, for example, make the battery storage economical. In order to capture these, we really kind of need to know across the time series how loads vary over time and how they align with resource profiles. So this slide just kind of shows what we mean by the coincidence of kind of resource and load profiles. So in this first plot, we have two large office building consumption profiles across the week from Sunday to Saturday. And then the next section is kind of these residential apartment building profiles. And then the last of these stack plots is the solar resource in these two locations, Denver and San Diego. So we can see how the timing of loads really matter and at which level they correspond to match with the solar resource, which can really drive what is economical for a specific region. So kind of given this background of how important load profiles are for REopt, we are able to kind of help sites at the different levels of analysis that they're interested in, and kind of depending on what data they're able to obtain. So at the most crude high level, if, for example, a site is looking just to screen generally before to down select sites, REopt can simulate these annual load profiles with only 2 user inputs, which is just based on location and building type. Kind of going down to a further deeper level of analysis, if the site is able to provide historic energy consumption data, this would improve the accuracy of the modeled results. And this could either be annual energy consumption in kilowatt hours or monthly kilowatt hour consumption, just based on utility bills. And then the final level of the most detailed results, if this would require 1 year of hourly or sub-hourly interval data, and just kind of given facility types, depending on the utility and meter at the site, this may or may not be available. So if folks are kind of interested in this level of analysis, this could potentially be obtained through reaching out to the utility or sometimes through the electric utility portal. And I think Jordan has sent out a survey, and most of you guys are not quite at this level of data availability, but hopefully kind of as the analyses progress, we'll be able to perform some specific site modeling using actual interval data. And if at any point anyone needs help kind of figuring out how to obtain this information or who to reach out to, please definitely get in touch. Okay, so that was just the quick overview, and now we're kind of going to jump into the modeled load data portion in REopt. Yes, so in order to model load data in REopt has kind of a default set of buildings that it has simulated, and these are based on the DOE commercial reference buildings data set. So there's 16 buildings in this data set, and they represent about 70% of all the commercial building stock in the US. And the loads are kind of modeled using Energy Plus simulations that vary, across the day, across the week, across seasons. And so in a representative week can be seen here of what these loads would look like for these various building types listed on this table on the right. So, covering offices, schools, restaurants, and then there's some specific building characteristics in terms of sizing that are also relevant. And then we keep emphasizing that this representative year is modeled as 2017, since kind of matching days of the week, weekdays and weekends are kind of important to align with the rate tariff. So taking these 16 buildings kind of in REopt, they then vary across the 16 climate zones across the US. So here is kind of a breakdown of what those climate zones are, what these different regions are, and the representative cities within each. So the 16 buildings will change consumption and load profile shape depending on which climate zone that they are in. Yes, so a default annual kilowatt hour consumption is calculated automatically once you select the location and building type. For those of you that kind of was part of the demo during the kickoff workshop, this was our example of 2 secondary schools, but because they're in different locations in Louisiana or San Diego, their load profiles are different. So these are just based on, differences in heating and cooling, across climate zones, kind of the efficiency of the building stock across climate zones. So this is kind of the level of detail that we would be able to achieve with the most basic assumptions. And moving into having more specific site inputs. As you mentioned earlier, if the site is able to provide, oh, Jordan, you have your hand up?
Hey, yeah, Zhang, I was wondering, can you go back 1 slide? I was curious for the basic data, for these basic data on building loads, so I guess I'm not exactly sure how to word this. For the very basic raw data that goes into this do you just have a rough average annual consumption for different building types, and then what you do is just modulate it throughout the year based on some kind of percentage related to the climate zone? Or do you actually have more granular timed consumptions, like for hospitals? Does the most basic layer of data have, like, hospitals across the US typically have more consumption in this month than this month? Or are you just taking that one sort of basic annual number and modulating it throughout the year based on climate zones?
So if I'm understanding correctly, these 16 building profiles are all modeled kind of at this hourly granularity to the best of kind of energy plus simulations ability. So they do vary by day, by weekday, weekend, across seasons. You know, schools might have lower consumption in the summer, for example, in certain climate zones. So they are very detailed hourly load models, but assuming a generic building type, right? So for example, small office are kind of assuming this size with this number of floors. So how that would vary across the year in a detailed way, and whether or not that variation matches your specific site would be the consideration, right? But it's not that the model of the small office in the default case is not accurate, right? It's just whether or not that matches your site is kind of the consideration.
That makes sense. Do you know this commercial reference building data set, like, do you know, based on the team that manages it? I'm just curious, like, what kind of sample size do they use to run these simulations for, like, a small office, for example?
Yeah, so I don't know the specific details of it. I did put links in the slides for folks who are interested in kind of reading up more about it and all the assumptions that go behind that modeling. Yeah, I'm sure they have, you know, Energy Plus is pretty detailed kind of building simulations. So there are, if you go through the link, there will be details about how that is done and all the considerations that went behind it, as well as kind of through the REopt help manual. There'll kind of be specifics about, you know, whatever folks are interested in.
Okay, awesome.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. So thanks for that clarification. It's definitely not that at the most basic level, it's just less accurate modeling. It's just whether or not it matches to your specific site. So kind of moving on to these more site-specific inputs, the modeling can be improved by entering what the energy consumption values are at the site. So for example, this is kind of what is under the load profiles accordion on the REopt web tool. I think most folks should be familiar with now after the demo. So you're able to select, for example, in this case, a hospital, and then it calculates a default kilowatt hours of annual consumption for this climate zone. So you could either use that value directly, or you can enter your own more site-specific data based on, you know, historic utility bills, for example. Or you could check this box here for monthly consumption and enter these kilowatt hour values by month. And so what this does behind the scenes is the REopt will still use the load shape of this commercial reference building, but then it will scale this shape to match either the annual or monthly consumption values. Okay. We have a question in the chat. How do these building models factor in heating? Gas furnace. Okay, maybe I should read them out loud so that it's part of the recording. How do these building models factor in heating? Seems like there could be a lot of variation in the building relying on gas furnace. It could be invisible on the electric side, but if the building is using electric resistance, it could be a significant winter load. Right. So I guess, I don't know, Kathleen or Indu, do you guys have comments on specifically for heating?
I think they make assumptions that can be described in the, also where Xiang was referencing in the commercial reference buildings landing page, the website. They make different assumptions based on, they have a profile for new builds, and then buildings built since I think 1980 and then pre-1980, and square footage assumptions for each, and then they conduct energy plus analysis as Xiang described. But I think there's assumptions like they assume that it's not electric heating, is my understanding. That should be confirmed on the website. But that definitely could impact, the profile.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, each building also has separate non-electric heating profile associated with it. And if you click on any of the thermal technologies, you will see that the commercial reference building also includes non-electric loads associated with these reference buildings. So we're just looking at electric loads for now, and that includes electric heating, and yeah, electric HVAC and electric water heaters, but there are non-electric thermal loads that are also associated with these reference buildings that can be modeled based on the housing stock for each of these climate zones.
Okay, thanks guys. Yeah, so REopt does model both electric and thermal loads, and kind of depending on the interest of the analysis, could explore options with different technologies. Cool. So moving on to the next slide. So here we're just kind of trying to emphasize that selecting the right building type, and then within that building type, selecting the right building size would also increase the accuracy of the model. So for example, offices, there are large, medium, and small office options kind of based on that initial square footage, number of floors. And then you can check the default kilowatt hours of each of these building types, and then kind of compare it to the actual annual kilowatt hours of the site, and selecting and down selecting within these options. For hotel, there's also small and large, and we just kind of want to emphasize that the load shape of these do differ. So it is not the same just putting in either a large or small hotel and just adjusting the annual kilowatt hours numbers directly. It would be helpful to kind of match it to be more size appropriate as well. And then finally, we have this electric slider option here that allow users to scale the input load data as well. So for example, you could adjust this anywhere from 0 to 200% of the original consumption of this building. So if you adjusted it here, in this case, to 120% of the original assumption, this will adjust the load at every hour by 120%. So how this might be used, what cases it may be useful. For example, we have two examples here where the building manager decides that the facility expects that the facility load will increase going forward by 20%. So then we can set the slider to 120%, or if the facility kind of has these energy efficiency load reduction goals already in mind and kind of in place, and knows that the load will go down by 20% and wants to size technology to that new baseline, they can adjust the slider to 80%. And this is kind of really important, just since the load entered in the analysis should be representative of kind of the performance over the entire analysis period, which we're looking at, 20, 25 years. So the slider can kind of help the user decide where that is versus just what the load currently is. And continuing with additional modeled load profiles, we also have these flat load options. So these are just constant loads, and we have 6 of these, depending on which hours of the year the load is active. So for example, the 24/7 profile, it is the truly flat constant load across all hours of the year. 24/5 is all hours of the weekday has a constant load. And then 16/7 is just a flat load from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. every single day. 16/5 is the same kind of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. flat load, but only on weekdays. Or you could also do these 8-hour shifts where it's flat load 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. either across the year or only on weekdays. So this is just an example here of what the 16/5 flat load profile would look like, where it's like Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. There's flat loads across the day from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., but the weekends there is no load. So typically these flat load cases, we consider, for example, data centers, factories, industrial processes that have pretty constant consumption, but they're also kind of helpful for scaling combined loads, which we'll talk about in the next slide. We also do calculate a default energy value for flat loads, and this is just based on the average consumption of all the commercial reference buildings for a given climate zone. And then this thing that I just mentioned about kind of combining loads, here it is under the Simulate Campus tab, under the load profiles recording on the web tool. So basically this allows a user to combine different building types. And this could either be used to approximate other types of facilities or model like a campus level load. So in this case here, we were trying to model laboratory loads, and the site decided that the closest approximation was to model it as 50% as a large office and 50% as a warehouse. And this is kind of what the output load profile will look like, combining those two profiles. You would also be able to enter an annual energy consumption in kilowatt hours at the top to kind of best approximate your building. So you can really kind of play around with these, add additional building types to kind of approximate your facility type to the best of your abilities. Yeah, so those are all the things I had on modeled load profiles in REopt. Does anyone have any questions about that before we kind of move on into working with interval data? Okay. So in terms of working with interval data, now we're kind of getting to the space where the site is able to get kind of hourly profiles from meter readings. So REopt here would then allow you to upload a custom load profile through this tab. And this is just taking in a CSV with either hourly, 30-minute or 15-minute loads in kW, so power values in kilowatts. And to kind of facilitate this process, you're able to download a sample Excel file to see how these loads should be uploaded. And this is just what it looks like. There's only 2 columns, one for the hour of the year, so 1 to 8760, and then the user would just input 1 column of these loads here in column B, and then upload it directly, and REopt would be able to optimize using that. The web tool does downsample 30 and 15-minute data before optimizing. So having the option to upload 30-minute or 15-minute data is just kind of a convenience for the user. If that's the format that their data comes in, it won't kind of improve the accuracy of results. That would be for more programmatic access, such as using REopt through the API. So some initial data processing considerations. We take in 1 year of historic hourly or sub-hourly data. So this should really be from January 1st to December 31st, because I know sometimes hourly data, it could be obtained for any period, maybe just from February of 2021 to March of 2022. So after the site kind of obtains this data, they would kind of concatenate it to create a representative year profile from January to December. And this is just so that it kind of matches with our resource profiles since we're modeling this full year. The PV profiles, for example, would really go from January to December, and we want to match that and best align it with the loads that are inputted. And then one other consideration, kind of when stitching this interval data together, is to always align days of the week, since that could really impact utility bill savings, depending on how complex the rate tariff is. There's time of use, energy and demand charge components. So when concatenating that data, it's kind of important to make sure that just when it's shifted, that the days of the week align and stitch together. If you end on Friday, the next period should start on Saturday. Okay. Question to clarify, does the model assume that the first row is January 1st, or does it look for a column that is formatted as a date? So I think that it assumes that the first is January 1st, 00, and then it goes all the way down. It is not checking for or processing a specific timestamp column. Yeah, so it's kind of important that we do that concatenation kind of outside of REopt and then upload that January 1st to December 31st load profile directly. And it also asks for the load year, and this is for the same purpose, you know, to just check what day of the week the year starts on, and processes all the rate tariffs accordingly. Okay, cool. So the next couple of slides cover data cleaning considerations, and these are just things that we have come across over and over again in our analyses. So we just want to point out a couple of tips for things to consider as you guys are kind of looking through interval data and processing it for REopt. So the first is kind of making sure that the values entered are power values in kilowatts instead of energy in kilowatt hours. And here, this example slide, some facilities output their depending on the way that the meter is, facilities can output just continuous energy consumption. So it adds on at each time step the energy consumed within the 15 minutes. And in this case, it's a 15-minute load data. So we would kind of take the difference in energy and calculate the power from that. Yeah. Just a thing to kind of note depending on what type of load data is obtained. And then the next consideration here, for example, is we typically fill data gaps through interpolation when they're relatively small. So for example, this facility had, what is this, 2, 3, 4 time steps of missing data for a section of the year. So we typically, for example, you could interpolate in any method that you choose. We, in this case, did it through Excel and just linearly interpolated across this period to avoid this large dip here. And the purpose of this is that we really want the load to be representative of the consumption over the entire analysis period. So we don't want to include these types of for example, here, outages or just missing data gaps in this 20-year analysis. And similarly, sometimes there's unrealistic spikes or outliers in the data, and we would use a similar interpolation method for that. So here, the original raw data was given from February of 2019. April of 2019 to February of 2020, and it had a few points up here of an unrealistic data spike. So we would remove this spike and then reconcatenate it so that it's from January to December. And And this just helps to ensure that realistic savings are captured. We don't want to be building a large system to remove this one spike in hopes of saving a ton in demand charges or something. Since REopt is a deterministic model, it is able to see these types of spikes. And it is also one of our considerations, even when the spikes are less extreme, just to be able to capture realistic savings. And then, okay, other kind of data cleaning considerations, when the data gaps are a little bit larger and it's difficult to interpolate, because if it varies across many hours, the loads typically fluctuate and we don't want to just directly do a straight line interpolation. And in these cases, we would fill data gaps using either days of the previous or following week, kind of making sure we stay with the same day of the week. So if it is missing data on a Wednesday, we may copy in Wednesday data from the week before or after, just to kind of maintain that consistency, since loads also do change. Weekday, weekend is the most typical pattern, but it could change depending on the day of the week as well. So these are types of considerations that should be kept in mind, depending on what types of patterns and typical variations occur at the site, whether the site is specific, has specific time of day considerations where there's a large evening spike, or weekday weekend variations, any seasonal changes. Here's just an example of a San Diego primary school where in the summer months it's much lower. So if it was missing the entirety of July's data, we maybe wouldn't want to copy it directly from June, for example. Yeah, so these are types of data cleaning considerations. And then the last piece that I wanted to mention kind of on this process interval load data is often sites may have just a small amount of interval data that doesn't cover the full year. And in those cases, you know, if you thought it was representative of the entire year, you could just kind of duplicate it many times. If there weren't going to be a lot of seasonal variations. And another option that we have done in the past is kind of using that partial data to match to a representative commercial reference building and scaling the energy consumption. So in this case, this example on the right here, this blue line is the utility meter data. In this case, they only had a week. So then we determined of all the commercial reference buildings, the closest match was this dashed green line here. This is what the raw commercial reference building profile would look like, but then we would use their site energy consumption monthly kilowatt hours to scale this commercial reference building to this solid green line that is in much closer alignment to what the actual site load is. So that is just another method for kind of approximating load more accurately given partial data. Any questions on utility interval data before we move on to resilience and critical loads?
Jean, can you just summarize again really quick how partial, like, yeah, how partial should someone's data be before they, like, how should someone decide whether to do this scaling or just rely on the commercial reference buildings?
I think like at any point, so for example, here we only had utility data for a week. So it is helpful to just kind of check general load shapes if it better aligns with any of the commercial reference buildings. It is, yeah, it's definitely the more data you have, the better it is. But I think even for very little data, it could be an input to kind of compare to see which one to select. And knowing your facility type, you know, so just knowing the facility type, if it's like a grocery store, it may not match closest to the DOE commercial reference building supermarket profile, but you know, just kind of playing around with a couple of load profiles to check whether or not, you know, the expected shape sort of matches.
Yeah, okay. And just checking, as of right now, this is sort of bespoke ad hoc kind of analysis on the part of the user, right? There's not like a easy way to, once you've cleaned your data, to kind of superimpose your shape of your load onto the commercial reference buildings, right? You sort of have to build this in Excel.
Yeah, I don't think we've standardized a way to just do a quick matching to say, like, it really depends on how much data the user has, and it'd probably be a more detailed analysis at that point.
Okay.
To do that, yeah, but yeah, so I think at this point it's still pretty much up to the user to decide. And then the next section is covering loads during outages. So kind of defining what a critical load is, and this is just the load that must be met during grid outage. And this may or may not be tied to the load during typical operations. So REopt has 3 options for entering this critical load. So it could either be a percentage of the typical load, you could upload a separate custom load profile, or kind of build out this critical load from a list of equipment at the site that will be operational during outages. And then we'll kind of walk through each of these. So the site critical load, this is once you check resilience at the top of the analysis goals, the resilience accordion will pop out, and these are the 3 tabs for the different methods. And method 1 is just directly entering a percent here. So the load will be a percent of the typical load. And it's good to note that this value kind of performs the same as that load slider, where it could be down to 0 or all the way up to 200%. And so critical loads are able to go beyond 100% of the facility's typical load, if it's expected that it will increase during outages, for example, at storm shelters. Method 2 is uploading a separate critical load profile, and this functionality is only available for registered users. So another plug for registering. It's really helpful to kind of be able to save all your analysis runs, kind of pass results back and forth, and do these more custom custom functionality for the web tool, be it kind of entering your own rate tariffs, or in this case, uploading a critical load profile. And it follows the same upload kind of CSV template that we discussed earlier, where it's like just hours of the year and your load profile in the second column. So the user can define their critical load to be whatever that different profile is, completely unrelated to your typical load. And then the third method is building out the critical load using specific load components. And this is also a functionality that's available for registered users. So if you clicked this build tab, it will bring you to something that looks like this, where you could enter different load types. It will automatically populate with a power value for that device. You could enter how many of those you anticipate at your site, the start and end of their operation, both in terms of time of day and month. So for example, the different load types, there are many more than what is listed here. There's quite a few different buckets. So for example, if we picked HVAC and used fans, it would automatically populate with a power value. We could say we have 3 fans at the site. They operate typically between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. only during the months of May to September. And then that you could add additional load components after that, and it will build out an 8760 load profile, critical load profile that will be activated during outages. Yes, so that kind of covers, how REopt handles loads, how we model loads with less user inputs, how we the considerations we go through for processing interval data, and then this is the kind of summing it up with how it could change with specific critical loads. With that, we've come to the end of the presentation. Does anyone have any general thoughts or concerns? Yeah, so thanks everyone for attending.
Have a good afternoon.